Welcome to the Dance NYC 2022 Symposium, Life Cycles, Livelihoods, Legacies. We will be with you shortly. Today's schedule. After this morning's warm welcome and wake up, we will now begin our 10 o'clock morning sessions. At 11:30, we'll move our bodies to a community dance break led by Kumbe Center for African and Diaspora Dance. Our early afternoon sessions will begin at 12 p.m., followed by a nourishing lunch at 1:30. At this time, you may also explore our exhibitor hall, where we will host the virtual expo showcase. At 2:30, we will begin our late afternoon sessions, followed by a 4:15 community daily debrief, where all attendees are encouraged to attend and discuss the day's activities. And at 6 o'clock, we will present our final keynote presentation. Accessibility. ASL interpretation and live captioning will be provided for today's session. A stream-to-text link will be posted in the chat and participation guide for access to the live transcription. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSimp, DanceNYC 2022, and DanceSimp2022. On Instagram at dance.nyc, on Twitter at dance.nyc, and on Facebook at dance/NYC. Community guidelines. Based on Dance NYC's values of justice, equity, and inclusion, we agree to share our opinions, challenge perspectives, and engage or debate respectfully, and acknowledge and course correct if harm is caused. Honor everyone's personhood and humanity. Not tolerate speech that is disparaging, abusive, violent, or that is intended to defame someone's character publicly. Some features not to miss. Build your agenda of sessions. Connect with other attendees. Join community conversations. Visit the exhibitor hall. Don't forget to check out the 2022 Symposium Digital Program Book. We are happy to be in community with you. Thanks for joining. Good morning. My name is Shani Jamila. I'm a conceptual artist, the founder of Lineage, a storytelling project that centers the voices of contemporary socially engaged Black artists, and the interim manager of programming at Dance NYC. I'm calling in from the Dance NYC offices, which are on the unceded territory of the Lenape, or Delaware people, also known as New York City. I'm an African-American woman who uses she, her pronouns. Today, I'm wearing a black and white dress, bright red lipstick. My earrings are a silver swirl. Behind me is a white wall of doors and 2 posters from the Dance NYC archives. I'd like to thank you for joining us for the completely digital 2022 Symposium held on the Hoover platform. It's a pleasure to be here with you to host this critically important session on a new economy of funding, featuring top representatives from the field. ASL interpreters from Sign Nexus and closed captioning services provided by the Viscardi Center will be available throughout the session. A stream to text link will also be available and posted in the chat for further reference. Speaker information may be found in the description below, as well as under the speakers module on the left side of your Hoover web app or the menu of your mobile app. This information is also available on our website. Feel free to post comments you want to share with the community in the chat section to the right of this event room. Dance NYC moderators will be interacting with you there. For this session, we don't have a designated time for Q&A. However, the panel is accepting questions that come in during the session. To submit questions, please use the Q&A tool in this digital room. The panel will try to answer them as the conversation takes place. After the session ends, there will be a follow-up in the community section of Whova, where you can continue the conversation. As we're at the mercy of technology, we want to remind you that there may be delays or sound issues that we experience during our time together. We invite you to extend us and each other grace and patience in the event that that does occur. And now, we enter arts philanthropy and a new economy of funding, valuing collective well-being. It will be moderated by the Executive Director of Dance NYC, Alejandra. Alejandra, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, Shani. Good morning.
Hello,
everyone. As Shani just named, my name is Alejandra Duque Cifuentes, and I'm the Executive Director of Dance NYC. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a non-disabled white Latina cis woman, originally from Medellin, Colombia, the unceded territory of the Nutabes people, currently home to Embera Catillo, Chami, Dovida, Senu, Quechua, and Inga populations. I have been working and living in Lenape-Hoking for 16 years now, and I am coming to you live from Dance NYC's offices in Gramercy. I have a mid-length brown hair that is pulled back. I am wearing a red and tan-striped long-sleeve shirt with a moonstone necklace and a red bold lip. I am in my office, and behind me you can see two framed graphics. One in orange that reads New Yorkers for Dance, and another in magenta which reads Artists are necessary workers. As Shani shared, today's session will look at how the funding community has responded to the changes and learnings COVID has revealed in order to focus on the well-being of individual arts workers, either through relief support, coalition building, or the proper resourcing of an organization's operations. To help us understand the context of the economic impact that this moment has set before us, I want to share some important pieces of data on what the creative economy has experienced. Nationally, arts and cultural workers and businesses have lost nearly $17.8 billion over the course of the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2020, the US arts economy shrank at nearly twice the rate of the economy as a whole. And the arts economy shed more than 500,000 jobs, not counting folks that are self-employed artists or cultural workers that don't identify primarily as artists. 95% of arts workers as a whole also lost their creative forms of income. And for dancers specifically, unemployment rates were at 10.8% in 2021. In New York City, we are finding that dance organizations and groups, their budgets have shrunk by an average of 31%, with the smallest organizations experiencing the greatest proportional impact. Individual workers also reported a cumulative loss of $4.7 million in income related to their art-making activity in New York City specifically. And really, the impact of the pandemic is on top of what in our city we've been experiencing as an ongoing affordability crisis. At the end of 2020 and into 2021, about 5% of the dance workforce had relocated permanently. About 17% of them were considering permanent relocation, and 43% of them were considering a long-term career option outside of dance. That's a huge loss for our dance and arts local economy. And of course, independent artists were naming that their basic needs, such as food, housing, access to medical or mental health services, were the hardest to acquire. On top of that, organizations were also experiencing severe losses. We know to date of at least 26 organizations and facilities previously only serving artists that have permanently closed in the city. But what we know about COVID is that it essentially accelerated the impact of the working and economic conditions that were already true of our sector. We know that small budget dance making groups, independent dance workers, who really represent the lion's share of the New York City dance economy, have long faced challenges and barriers that don't allow them to access dignified wages and have sustainable labor. They experience really high rates of self-employment, part-time employment, and freelance gig work. They have often irregular or unpredictable income streams. They lack access to affordable medical and mental health care, and have difficulty locating affordable space to develop and present their work. On top of that, for dance workers, there are low levels of unionization and labor protections that establish wage standards for their day-to-day activities. The reality is that dance makers articulate that many of these challenges are rooted in systemic racism and other forms of oppression. And all of this ultimately suggests that while art is valued, the art maker is not. And so with today's conversation, we're going to look at a variety of folks who have come together over the past 2 years: organizers, service organizations, and private and public funders who have taken to task to address some of these systemic issues in order to invest in safety nets that support arts workers and organizations. I am really excited to introduce you to our first group of folks that we're going to chat with: Anna, Sarah, and Michelle. So why don't you all join us on screen? Folks, I am so glad that you're with me bright and early on this Saturday morning. It's like spring continues to visit us. A little rain, a little sun. It's kind of taking turns. I want to start by hearing a little bit about each of you, who you are, and the work and the programs that you've been developing and implementing, and what are some of the ecosystemic issues they'll be naming. They're trying to address. So let's start with you, Sarah. Why don't you introduce yourself? And let's do this. Let's do introductions first, and then in the same order, you can go ahead and tell us about the programs you're working on. So Sarah, Michelle, Anna.
Sounds great. Thank you, Alejandra. My name is Sarah Calderon. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. I am the executive director of Creatives Rebuild New York, and I am a white cisgender woman with dark brown hair, hazel eyes. Today I'm wearing some clear glasses, a black shirt. I have some gold jewelry on, and behind me I have a framed painted burlap sack framed in maroon and some white and gray walls. And I am coming to the Zoom from the unceded Lenape land, currently known as Manhattan. And I think I'll leave it there. Is that what we want now? And then we'll come back. Great.
Morning, my name is Michelle Bay, pronouns she, her, hers. Currently calling in from the land of Lenape, also known as Brooklyn. I am a non-disabled East Asian woman of Korean heritage, currently with long black hair, wearing a black turtleneck and glasses with white rims. My background is a white wall, and I'm going to leave it there as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. My name's Anna Campbell. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Senior Program Officer at the Howard Gilman Foundation based in New York City. And I am calling in from the unceded lands of the Munsing Lenape, currently known as Westchester County. I am sitting in a room with light blue walls and in front of a window with a curtain drawn down. I am a white cisgender woman with brown hair, some hoop earrings, and you can see a little bit of my orange top at the bottom of the screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Sarah, tell us what you've been working on. It's a pretty significant project that is about to impact the lives of many, many artists across New York State. How is Creative Rebuild New York going?
That's a great question, Alejandra, thanks. So Creatives Rebuild New York, for those who don't know about it, it was set up as a $125 million investment. Then that investment came from 3 foundations, from the Mellon Foundation, from the Ford Foundation, from the New York Ghost Foundation. And it was set up as an investment in supporting artists and the organizations that employ them across New York State. And I can say that we've really learned so much already. So we were set up in July, like this past July, July of 2021. And I think some of the first work that we did was setting up an organization, understanding how to launch an independent organization from a foundation, and then quickly begin to figure out how to support models for artist employment and financial stability, while also understanding that this work really was launched out of emergency relief, but that we know, and Alejandra, you just referred to this, that we need to embed this in future policy because this need for stability for artists has been happening for years before this. In addition, we've been learning a lot about, in our planning stage, so we were really lucky enough to engage about 30 artists in a think tank to help us co-create the 2 funding opportunities that we have. One is artist employment, and the other is guaranteed income. And artist employment is for 300 artists across the state and organizations, and guaranteed income will be for 2,400 artists across the state. And working with them, it was a lot about figuring out how really to center artists while also working to support this broader arts and cultural ecosystem. And now we actually have the application phase open, which is very exciting. But I think we're learning a lot. We're learning about what we could have done differently, better, in a more thoughtful way. But we're also asking people to do quite a lot, right? And this idea that we are asking, for example, in the artist employment program for a joint application process really has pushed us to realize that sort of catalyzing what we want to see in the world via an application process might be easier said than done. So this joint application process had a goal of creating shared power within an application process, but has proven a little bit more difficult for some folks. And then I'll just end, in general, there are things that we were able to consider, but there have been a lot of issues dealing with giving folks, individuals funding, individuals money, cash, that we've many issues that we've run into based on the law. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later. So I'll stop there.
So Sarah, just as a short recap for folks that were listening, Creatives Rebuild New York has 2 programs. One where artists are paired with an organization as a full-time employee to both work within the entity and to work on their art. And a second program of guaranteed income, which will provide $1,000 a month for 12 months to 2,400 artists, no questions asked. And this is meant to ensure that they have some kind of baseline financial support as individuals working in the arts and contributing to their local communities. So those are the 2 programs. Michelle, tell us a little bit about this program that the Laurie Tisch Illumination Fund put together. And I believe it was the first time in 14 years that the fund had an open call, right?
Yes, exactly. The first time in 14 years. And it was a big step for us because we typically do not accept unsolicited proposals or LOIs or meetings. And so this was a really great opportunity to learn more about the needs of arts organizations during the pandemic. So for us, we launched the Arts and Mental Health Initiative last fall. Even before the pandemic, though, our foundation was talking about mental health for the arts community, given our funding priorities that focus on utilizing the arts to address issues such as trauma, stigma, and aging-related diseases like dementia and Parkinson's. So when the pandemic started and it was becoming clear that what we thought was going to be a couple of months at home turning into a very prolonged shutdown, we realized that we needed to pivot and that we needed to start supporting mental health services and grants for New Yorkers, particularly those from marginalized communities. We knew we wanted to fund arts organizations, artists, and arts workers because, one, the devastation of the creative economy. Two, we see the arts as inherently therapeutic. And three, we see the arts as a low barrier to engagement, given the stigma of mental health in communities of color and immigrant communities. And so when I'm talking about mental health support and services for these communities, I'm talking about examples such as hiring a specialist to incorporate trauma-informed care and curriculum into existing programming and events, bringing in mental health professionals to support staff at arts organizations, and also individual grants and actual money for artists so they can get the mental health support that they see fit, such as medication and talk therapy. And for us, we wanted to do an open call because we wanted to fund arts organizations that are currently outside of our circle. And it worked. We attracted a far broader and more diverse set of applications that we've had before. And we learned a lot about new arts organizations in New York City. So I'll end it right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Anna, Gilman has for a very long time been supporting New York City-based arts organizations with general operating support. And I know you and I have had conversations about what are the ways to provide that general operation support, and how do you strengthen organizations so that they can weather change, they can weather transition, they can weather crisis, and they can remain pillars in their community. Tell us a little bit about some of the ways in which Gilman does this.
Sure. Thanks for that intro, Ali. That was everything I was going to say. The foundation was rebooted in 2014, and with that reboot, there was a clear premise that was general operating support was the key to arts organizations being able to do the work that their mission drives them to do. And so we know that artists and arts workers and organizational leaders all, want general operating support for the flexibility it provides, particularly around supporting artists and staff in organizations where funding often is so directed towards a very specific project or product related outcomes. Our interest is more in the holistic health of an organization so that organization can do its best work. And we know that you can't do your best work if you're not taking care of the people that are doing that work. And so our thinking is that the general operating support allows organizations to actually do that, to care for the artists and the staff so they can achieve, the incredible artistry that they're making or they're doing. So this is a very trust-based approach. The general operating support is one angle of the kind of funding we make, but we're also very interested in and focused on what we call capitalization, which is essentially building what I refer to a lot as the foundation of a home. So if you don't have a strong foundation, strong beams, strong joints, then everything you build on top of that foundation will be wobbly. And so we want to make sure that foundation is strong. And that's where a lot of that capitalization investment comes in. So we will invest in debt reduction, in capital, in bricks and mortar kind of fundraising, artistic reserves, cash reserves, those sorts of things. So organizations are better equipped to take advantage of the artistic opportunities that are out there and, weather those storms when they do come. And one thing I would also add to that is we're well aware that our $250,000 budget minimum allows the foundation to work with only a piece of the sector. And there's a much larger part of the sector that's smaller or not as large as the $250,000 minimum that we have. So we have started some regranting programs with partners, including Dance NYC, to try to mimic this approach with organizations that we can't fund directly. And so I'm very excited that the latest cohort of the Dance Advancement Fund has been announced, more general operating support for organizations with budgets not quite at the $250,000 limit for Gilman and a larger limit for the fund itself. So I think I'll end there for now.
So let's talk, the three of us, about some of the, I think a little bit about how we've known for a while that there were some infrastructure issues in arts and culture, right? We have these conversations regularly across the funding community. They happen regularly between individual artists, organizations, where there is a mismatch between the kind of process-based work that artistry is and the product-based economy, where tickets or how artists earn a living are based on the very tip of the iceberg of what it costs or what it's required for that work to be experienced and capitalized. And so I think with COVID, we all found ourselves in a situation where, okay, living wages is an issue. Infrastructure is an issue. And by infrastructure, I mean some of the, if we pull back from looking only at dance or only at theater or only at visual arts, if we pull back as a city, as a state, and as a nation, we don't have a strong infrastructure around accessible and affordable healthcare, for example, housing. There are basic kind of social infrastructures that are missing, that are particularly stark in arts and culture because of the gig nature and the independent worker way in which the economy is put together. And then on top of that, then we have just severe underinvestment and often intentional underinvestment, right? In BIPOC communities, in disabled-led organizations, immigrant-led entities, by all kinds of different sets of policies at the public level, and segregation as it reflects itself in our city specifically. So looking at those conditions, right, I feel like across the philanthropic community, folks are starting to kind of take their lanes around what are the issues that they are best positioned to address. Sarah, I know that folks are really eager to learn about, the guaranteed income program. Why? Why is that a thing that we needed to pilot? Who are we trying to say that this works to? and what is the desired impact that we hope it has for artists?
Sure. I think, as you alluded to, Alejandra, right, the nuanced way that artists work is just not out there. People don't understand how they work, right? Folks understand and appreciate artist product, but not their process. And so I think the more that we can understand how do we actually support with different types of models, one of them being guaranteed income, the process that the actual work that they do, right? There's some folks that understand that they actually are working each day, and others that they don't see it. So they don't understand it, and therefore they don't want to support it with public, especially with public funds. And also, and in this case, right, private funds. I think philanthropy is now moving to understand what it means to actually support individuals and to start to understand the nuanced way that artists work. And so I think when guaranteed income was set up as a model and artist employment were set up as a model, it was really to understand sort of which works best for artists and what is it that artists need within guaranteed income. And so when we talked to Creatives Rebuild New York, and then Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco set up guaranteed income for artists, and Springboard for the Arts in St. Paul, Minnesota set up a guaranteed income for artists program. We're really looking at understanding not necessarily how do we set up more guaranteed income programs just for artists, but as an outcome, really, how do artists work and how can this support their work? And then how can that learning be built into broader policy that is happening around guaranteed income and around supporting workers, not just artists, but artists and other gig workers? How can we really think about how to support this broader way of living? And then I think our job at Creatives Rebuild New York, beyond giving out these funds, because again, it is a lot of money, but it's only going to support 2,400 artists across the state. And I think our job then is to lift up those learnings and to start advocating for policy that is inclusive and understands the way that artists work.
One of the things that's come up in the chat is when you're both, and I think this might be also true for you, Michelle, and correct me if I'm wrong, these are in many ways pilot programs, but it's unclear whether they will, well, with Creatives Rebuild New York, it's very clear the start and end time. With the mental health program, it's something that you're piloting, and you may or may not have yet decided if it's something that will continue. One of the things that happens often in moments of crisis is that we develop these new methodologies of support. We identify these areas where help is needed. We come in, we kind of bring a lot of support. We shower the need, right? And then that support dries out. And it once again creates the same gap that existed before. How are the three of you, and I know for you, Anna, Gilman has a kind of multi-year relationship with the folks that you grant. How are you three thinking about the steps that you're taking to address the gap that may be formed in your absence?
I'll just say quickly that the organizations that we work with and I work with specifically have been talking about these issues for a long time. These are not pandemic related issues necessarily. They existed before. And so I think the heightened attention is both on the philanthropic side, but also within the leadership and, you know, the community that this affects. And so it's very, you know, having standard labor, you know, practices and salary levels, expectations around that. If that's something that is widely accepted or shared, if, you know, Creatives Rebuild becomes something that's really effective with this cohort, I think there is a lot of momentum in the field to make it happen. And so there's a level of accountability, both on the terms of the philanthropic side of things, but also within the leadership in the field. If this is something that needs to be done, I think if the conversation continues, this will continue to get that kind of attention from funders and communities and audiences.
So this is Michelle. So for us, I mean, mental health has been an important health issue even before the pandemic. And we know that it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so for us, the pandemic is an ongoing issue. So beyond our 2-year grants to the RFP process that we had completed last year, what we can do is really raise awareness of the importance of funding mental health support and services within the arts and culture field. That means having conversation with our peer funders, or funding peers, to really consider what investing in artists look like, not only for their skills, creativity, and artistry, but for the overall well-being and health of artists, which also include their mental and emotional health. So I'll leave it right there.
I'll just jump in quickly. I think I said something before to this, but I think, we are investing funds in impact and narrative change for this reason, right? We know that we're going out of business, but our goal really is to be able to move, be able to embed the work, to seed the work so that it can happen and doing that with various audiences, whether it's politicians or philanthropy or communities, to really understand what's happening, how we're working, and to tell the stories.
So the three of you are working in philanthropy, but you're also individual arts workers yourselves as funders in this community, in this sector. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered along the way? What are some of the things that you've learned that you didn't realize were gonna surface?
Do you mean long-term or over the past 2 years of this work?
Either.
Well, I'll just say, I think the turnout, the massive demand of relief and resources since March 2020 shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was pretty stunning, and it continues. And I know this is not technically a learning, but it is something that gives pause, I think, both to me and my colleagues, and, I think the larger, the bigger social sector. And so that, to me, I think is very powerful and, speaks to the continuity of this work beyond pilot programs and, what this means long term.
I can jump in quickly. I think I've been surprised by the difficulty in philanthropy and the ability for private funds, philanthropic funds, to go to individuals. And so I think we've been learning a lot about the IRS and a lot of interaction with lawyers, all about how to make that happen. And it's just harder than one would imagine.
Sarah, I want to do a fourth wall peeling situation here. I want to peel the curtain here, because for many artists, it might not be obvious. What are some of the restrictions that private philanthropies may face when it comes to distributing funds? Can you tell us just a little bit more in detail, why might a foundation not be able, for example, to give an individual fund? And I want to say that it's important to share this because our opening keynote started with contextualizing the moment we're in with the changes that emerged after the culture wars and how public funding for individual artists shifted. So it would be so helpful, I think, for folks to hear, what are some of those restrictions that foundations have? Why can't they just write the check to the artist, put the money directly in the hand of the individual? Why does it have to go sometimes through an organization? Why do we have to have service organizations as re-granting partners? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, I'll try and make this as quick as possible. But I think basically, in order to give funds, foundations need to determine charitable need. And so when you're talking about individuals, it's difficult to do. It's almost impossible to do non-means tested funding. And so basically you need to ensure that the folks that you're giving funds to have financial need. And what many lawyers within foundations will say is, for example, when you're thinking about guaranteed income, when you give folks guaranteed income and you say, okay, can you determine that they have financial need? Yes, we figured out a way to do that. It's imperfect. It's extremely imperfect because it is almost impossible to take into account all of the nuanced ways that folks live their lives, especially artists. But then once you do that, there's this question of for them to continue to have financial need. right? But the whole point of having guaranteed income is so that people don't continue to have financial need, so that in 12 months or 18 months, if you need to continue to demonstrate that, it becomes very difficult. And against it's again sort of the point of the work. So the idea of giving it to an organization that just through their 501c3 demonstrates charitable need becomes much easier to do.
And so as a rounding out clarifying point for artists that are listening, it is connected to how the IRS tax code is put together in terms of what is considered charity and what is not, which is also connected to the longstanding legal and financial infrastructure of how the philanthropic sector is set into place as a tax break for those that contribute towards philanthropy, whether that's through large sums of money that are left after they've passed, earnings from a particular for-profit entity, or individual donations. And so there are nuances around tax and the tax code and the legal intricacies of it that sometimes prohibit specific foundations or many foundations from being able to directly give unrestricted cash to individuals. Similarly, for nonprofit entities, there are a variety of levels of red tape that are having to be crossed at the legal or financial level in order for that money to be able to be funneled out. And so the infrastructure of either service organizations or 501c3s getting those funds first before they arrive at an individual's hand is a little bit of a dance, and it requires a level of creativity, both from attorneys and accountants, and also a profound need for advocacy amongst all of us in the changing of tax code and tax law. So I think this is a great segue to our three panelists, Moira, Randi, and Risa. Thank you so much, Anna, Michelle, and Sarah. The three folks that are going to join us now are exactly those people, folks that are 501c3s that are redirecting resources to the community in different ways, whether it's institutions or individuals. And all three of them worked on very different, but also very similar relief programs to respond to the needs of artists when the pandemic arrived. So Moira, Risa, Randi, in that order. Why don't you introduce yourselves and then tell us a little bit about the programs that you were a part of stewarding?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you. Hi. So I'm Moira Brennan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a non-disabled cis white woman. I am calling in from the unceded Lenape territories. I am a red-haired, middle-aged woman with freckles. I'm wearing pink glasses. I'm sitting in a room with a tall bookshelf behind me and some tall plants behind me as well, and I'm wearing a blue sweater. And I will leave my introduction at that, and we'll come back for information about my associated organizations. Thanks.
Hi, folks. My name is Risa Shoup. I am the interim executive director of the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a white non-binary person with short dark hair, wearing a dark green, blue, red plaid button-down shirt. And my Zoom background is blurred, but I'm sitting indoors with overhead lighting. And I am speaking to you from the unceded land of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples in what is also known as the New York City neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Randi Berry. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a non-disabled white cis woman. I have short, grayish, brownish blonde hair that's around shoulder length. I'm wearing black and red glasses and a black dress. The the walls behind me are yellow with various pieces of art, and there's a blue chair in the background. I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Munsee, Lenape, Canarsie, and Matinacock people. That's it.
All right, Moira, tell us about Artist Relief. Woo! No pressure.
Yeah, a pleasure to talk about Artist Relief. So Artist Relief was a coming together in March and April of 2020 of 7 organizations, intermediaries, re-grant organizations. Those 7 organizations were the Academy of American Poets, Artadia, Creative Capital, Foundation for Contemporary Arts, United States Artists, and Young Arts. Artist Relief was a relief fund for artists who were enduring losses as a result of COVID-19. It began with a $5 million seed grant from the Mellon Foundation, and in total raised about $25 million from hundreds of individuals and funders to make emergency grants of $5,000 each, which eventually went to about 5,000 artists over a period of 15 months. And the fund came to a suspension or close. It's not officially closed yet, but no longer receives applications in June of 2021. Yeah, so that's the overview of Artist Relief. One of many, many efforts toward relief for artists, of course, at that time, but one that had a lot of spotlight shown on it.
Risa, tell us about City Artists Corps.
Sure. I'm thrilled to, and I'm going to give a little info about Art New York too, to just kind of get people introduced to us. So Art New York is a service organization representing the needs and operations of over 400 nonprofit and spirit member theaters in New York City and throughout New York State. And we do a lot. We provide educational programming and a wide array of subsidized space programs. But as Alejandra just said, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll focus on the funding opportunities that we coordinate through a number of different programs. And before I continue with that, I just need to give a big shout out to my colleague, Corrine Woods, who leads our grant making at Art New York and is much more eloquent than I am on these topics. But fortunately for her, is taking some time off this weekend and couldn't be here today. So you're stuck with me. The majority of our funding programs are directed to the needs of smaller budget sized theaters. And for us, that means theaters with budgets under $500,000, which are also well over half of our membership. We develop our funds, we develop our own funds, and then we're also a regrantor, and we regrant for private foundations like the Howard Gilman Foundation. So glad to have Anna in this room today, and the Mellon Foundation. And then we also regrant for the New York State Council on the Arts. At the start of COVID, we also started our own COVID relief fund for small theaters. And then, yes, this past summer, we had the honor of taking a lead organizing role together with Indie Theater Fund, and I know Randi's going to speak after me, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and of course, Dance NYC, to coordinate distribution of funds through a coalition of roughly 14 artist service organizations as part of the City Artist Corps grant program. As some of you may know, the first 2 rounds of the City Artist Corps grant program were coordinated by a singular entity, the New York Foundation for the Arts. And then the 3rd round was coordinated by our coalition. This was a tremendous learning opportunity. I think we pulled off a massive collaboration in a very constrained period of time. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about that today.
Randi, tell us about the wedding, tell us about Indie Theater Fund and space and emergency grants pre and post COVID. And of course, the Cultural Solidarity Fund.
Sure, I'm happy to. So IndieSpace and the Indie Theater Fund, who signed papers to merge last weekend, are 2 organizations that have been serving indie theater artists, individuals, small companies, and venues with radically transparent, responsive, and equitable funding, real estate programs, community resources, and advocacy. The Indie Theater Fund has been around for a little over a decade, and the premise of the fund was to address systemic inequities in the philanthropic foundation landscape. And coalition building is built into our organization. We started at the very beginning with a nickel per ticket program. So all of the theater companies that started with us, there were 40 that started with us in 2012, were contributing a nickel per ticket to their shows, into a pool of funds that would go back out into our community, so that when we're doing well and we're selling out in our shows, that we can lift the community up together and grant those funds back out to those of us that need it most. IndieSpace was also created to address systemic inequities in real estate and helping artists access real estate who have been historically excluded from that experience. So coalition building is in our blood. It is why we were created. And during the pandemic, we leaned into those resources to try to help us and our community get through. We did a lot of coalition building during this time. We participated in City Artists Corps, as Risa mentioned. We put together, with leadership of Jimena Garnica of Le May and 17 other cultural institutions, that came together to create the Cultural Solidarity Fund. I'll tell you more about Cultural Solidarity Fund, but we also work closely with Dance NYC, Dance Union, and the Low Income Artists and Freelancers Fund to provide rapid relief support as well. So I feel very strongly that the only way we get through this time is by working together and creating partnerships, so that we share resources and we share the burden of the labor that goes into funding for our community. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So you mentioned coalition, you mentioned collaboration. Moira, you mentioned the entities and the funders that came together. I want to talk a little bit more about, all of us in many ways were having to respond quickly to the losses that artists were experiencing. And the main goal, I think, was the same throughout. Money in the hands of artists now. Mm-hmm. The end. Nothing further than that. But to do that, there was a lot of collaboration that had to happen. There was a lot of coordination that needed to happen, and an establishment of values, of methodology, of literal administrative processes. Can the three of you tell us a little bit about what was that like to move from being individual entities where you do your regranting and your thing, to suddenly, and I know not suddenly for you, Randi, but at a different scale, moving into this kind of collaborative mode of working? What are some of the things that were really exciting about what you were doing? And what are some of the things that were challenging that sometimes the artist that was applying didn't know was happening?
Sure. I'm happy to try to start us off. I think that coalition-based work, whether it's for the purposes of developing funding programs or for other kinds of advocacy efforts, or even as, I think artists in the audiences will have experienced in making a project together, demands time. And it often demands more time than other systems will allow. And I would say this was definitely a challenge for the coalition of service orgs who came together to coordinate our round of the City Artist Corps grant program, and where we were given a very urgent deadline by our partners in city government that was directly informed by a constrained timeline due to the requirements of needing to spend federal dollars by a certain date, as well as the need for the city to process funding in a specific way. And I'll just for a second point back to some of what Sarah Calderon was speaking about earlier, that there are certain kinds of restrictions on how funding is given away. And we had to comport with those by law, and that takes time and took time away from work that took time away from work that we would have otherwise done to build necessary trust between us. So we worked as I said earlier, we worked very, very fast. both to bring our coalition together and then develop mechanisms through which we gave out roughly $3,000, $5,000 grants directly to New York City artists. The other thing I'll say here that was both exciting and new for Art New York is, Art New York, again, represents the needs of member theaters, which are groups, right? However they're incorporated, they're groups. And it was new and exciting for us to run help run a funding program that gave grants to individuals. But that presented some need for education for me and for my staff, because again, that was a new activity for us. The other thing I'll say, this funding program, again, was done last summer. We're 18 months into this pandemic. We're all exhausted. Working collaboratively, and I think this goes to what Randi was saying earlier, was essential so that we could maximize really limited capacity and bandwidth in order to comport with constrained timelines. And of course, most importantly, to get money in the hands of artists.
I wanted to add something, or just reflect on something you just said, Risa, relative to artist relief. One of the things, so I think if you talk to the folks who worked on artist relief, especially in the very beginning of its establishment, you hear that for many, even those who have been in the field for a very long time, that it was a highlight, if not the highlight of their career, which I think is very, very important thing to understand and distill. And for us, the funding sort of drive actually was not from the funder. So it wasn't that a bunch of philanthropy came together and decided to do this thing and then handed it off to the intermediaries. It was designed and developed by the intermediaries. And in a certain way, the funders surrendered, I hope that's not too dramatic a word to use, but surrendered to this idea. And that created enormous ease. Actually, I mean, it wasn't easy to do. And there was an ease on the part of the people who were trying to get it done. But there was a kind of ease relative to how it usually functions, that we weren't on a funder timeline, right? And we weren't under a funder directive. And many, high praise to them, of those philanthropies that supported artist relief suspended a lot of their usual practices and protocols around how they funded. So that is indeed a model, I think, for how we want to think moving forward. Of course, you run into all of those IRS issues that we've already been talking about. We were also very highly, whoops, I'm talking too fast. Sorry, let me slow down. We were we benefited highly from everything about United States artists, but in particular, the fact that they were already established with the IRS to give money directly to individuals, long-standing practice there, with a lot of good lawyers around them. So that's just reporting in a little bit from the artist relief experience.
I'll echo what they each have said, and don't need to add too much to it. To me, the challenges and the benefits are really they're around shared values, and that needing to establish that first before you can work together in any way whatsoever. And if those values meet and you can also lean into your individual experience and expertise, the ability to thrive grows exponentially with the more partners that you have. But it takes a tremendous amount of time, and time was not something that was afforded to any of us at any moment throughout this pandemic. So that was a challenge, and we have to be willing for it to not work and for us to mess up, and then for us to be honest about that and try something different again in the middle of the experience, which is difficult when you're serving thousands of people. But that was key. That was another key learning, I think, for all of us together, with all the various cultures at each of our organizations, and how that plays out when you're collaborating in this way.
So I want to highlight some of the things that you've said. Establishing shared values, trust from the philanthropic community that we were doing what artists needed and wanted us to do. And then the shared kind of capacity, administrative infrastructures that we each had as coalition members of the different groups that each of you were a part of. I want to talk about the role of the artist in the development of all of this. When each of your programs was being developed, where was the artist? Was the artist in the room? Was the artist being spoken to or about?
For our organization, first of all, there's artists on our board, and there's a minimum requirement for a certain number of artists to be serving on our board, so that will influence any of our programming. But also, I am an artist, and we survey our artists multiple times throughout any year to inform our program. For the Cultural Solidarity Fund, the group of organizers of 17 organizations that came together, many of them were arts institutions or artists themselves or individual arts workers. So the artist has always been central to the process. And then I'll just say one other thing. I think one of the reasons we intermediaries work well as regranters for funders is because of how deeply connected we are with artists on an ongoing basis because of the other services that we provide, the funding, the education, the professional development. So the artists are in conversation with us, all of us, on a consistent basis throughout the year, not just during COVID.
I'd echo that, especially the piece that Randi just spoke about, the unique role intermediaries can play, specifically with regard to the City Artist Corps grant program. I do think something that we could not completely fulfill was the ability to talk to and with artists in the development of our mechanisms and our operations together. And this was, I would say very much because of the timelines imposed on us. That said, again, this was a coalition of 14 artist service orgs, of which Art New York, Dance NYC, Indie Theater Fund are just 3. We do have artists on staff. I'm not an artist, but a lot of the staff that I worked with on my side are artists. And of course, our constituents are again, Art New York's constituents are member companies filled with artists. And we did get to do some outreach with them to best, I think, understand how we could participate in this. But I will, I want to be honest and name that the timing constraints prevented us from doing that to the fullness we otherwise would have liked to. The other thing I'd say is, again, where this came in the course of the pandemic, we had been in direct touch with our artist constituencies through many platforms, including our educational programs, roundtables, town halls, etc. So I do think we felt well informed about the particular needs of our members. But timing really does create an imposition to, as I think Alejandra, you so eloquently put it, talking to rather than about the artist. And I want to name that.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's a really important notion in general is proximity to the folks that you are working with and on behalf of. And that definitely came up at Artist Relief because we were 7 national organizations and either white-led or perceived to be, or, sort of in a white space. So that came up in a number of different ways. We made a determined decision not to have an advisory council of artists, in part, I think, because it felt at the time like it was an ask and a request of their time and effort, and not, it was at the time of the murder of George Floyd, when we turned some of the funds to mutual aid groups. So rather than making grants in the same way that we were typically making grants, we made larger grants to mutual aid, in part in recognition of the fact that we didn't have the right proximity all the time to those that we were serving.
So I'm going to now move us into what to me is the meatiest part of this conversation. How we were collaborating and how coalition-based funding was happening, not just coalitions of funders supporting one thing, but coalitions of service organizations working together to then do a thing. How are these coalitions reimagining and challenging the existing methods by which money gets out in our field? And in doing that, how are we essentially and working towards interrupting how white supremacy is showing up in arts and culture. For example, the four of us that lead institutions are white women, are white folks, are white people. And so how our roles as leaders in the institutions that we're running, our roles in coalition, and then also our collaborations, how are all of these things showing up?
So one thing I remember talking about at the start of the City Artist Corps grant program was the need to put our missions aside because we were working in coalition. And again, in our case, we were distributing money to individuals, which is not something that we typically do. And that's a huge thing, I think, to ask of your nonprofit, to put its mission aside. Like, that's what you do. That's how you're driven. That's how you know how to make decisions at a very base level. But to me, that elevates what I think we have to do as white leaders. We have to put our lived experiences, our understanding of privilege, our understanding of lack of access, our understanding of our own importance and relevance in the world aside, and, develop new ways of taking leadership from those who are most impacted by whatever situation we're trying to work together to change. And so it was, again, I can't stress enough how pivotal it was for Art New York to go, okay, we represent these over 400 nonprofit and nonprofit in spirit theater companies. But for the purposes of this grant program, we are focused on individual arts workers across disciplines. And we are going to do this work because, of course, some of the funding will benefit the people who work at our member theaters, but also because we have the infrastructure and we have the bandwidth to contribute to this at a time when we are most needed, and we must do that. And I do not say that as a martyr. This isn't, this tremendous source of pride that I put things aside to do this with my organization. It's just what we should do because we can do it in a moment of crisis. And part of doing it means, again, putting aside our own well-informed lived experiences and missions and goals, to be part of something much bigger than ourselves.
All of that, 100%. And also, working in coalition allows us to, well, first of all, as white folks, we have a proximity to power in a way that has to be named. And I think it's our role and job for the time being that we're in these roles and jobs to speak loudly about what we're hearing from the field and others with other lived experiences are asking of us. And when we work together, we can be much louder about it. With City Artist Corps, the Department of Cultural Affairs, all of a sudden we were 15 as one, or 14 as one, instead of 14 different organizations with 14 different sets of values that were going to address all of the grantees in different ways. All of a sudden, we all had shared values. We all decided we were going to prioritize those that were most deeply impacted by COVID, and we were able to shift priorities in the grant making. So we decided, we worked together to come up with the algorithm that would make sure that our grantee pool reflected the census, the demographics of our city. That's a big deal. And we were able to do that because we did it together. That's the reason why we were able to make sure that those that needed those funds most, to the extent that we could, because everybody needed the funds, let's be real, but those that needed them most and have been historically excluded from them could reach them. So, and that happened because we worked together. That's, to me, the way we interrupt white supremacy when we happen to be also white leaders of these organizations.
Moira, we can't hear you.
Sorry, thanks. I'll quickly that, so it's a, alongside the white supremacist categorization is the meritocratic categorization, right? They're linked. And so one of the things, it's not small, but it feels sometimes like we'd love to do so much more. But for example, at Map Fund, one of the things we took from our experience at Artist Relief is to embed random selection into our grant selection process. We're exploring it. We're using it in a variety of different ways, which we can speak to another time. But so to just start to wade into some of those practices and policies that allow us to step away from the meritocratic thinking. Also, and Risa just reminded me, there's some folks working on a common application, which I think is along sort of the same lines. I can't really speak to that myself. Maybe you can, Randi, because I'm not on that committee, but similar, like kind of just pushing against some of those practices.
And for context of the committee and common application, there is a coalition of New York-based arts funders that gather to learn best practices from one another, to understand in collaboration with service organizations what's happening in the field. And one of the discussions that has been resurfacing since the coalition work that emerged during COVID is a conversation about a common application. And overall, and most importantly, ways in which all of us, whether there's a common application or not, reduce the labor that artists have to go through in order to access necessary funding. So with that, Randi, take it away.
Yeah, I was going to speak on the common application and also some of the coalition building that's happening around advocacy that Risa and Art New York have been taking, and New Yorkers for Arts and Culture have been taking a real lead on, and on behalf of the community, bringing us together to talk. And also there's a group of us that are meeting around a service org safety net. What does it look like for service organizations to be working together on an ongoing basis with partnership in the with funders, so that we are ready for the next inevitable disaster with climate change and just the world. Are we ready? Can we mobilize funds quickly? But I have ulterior motives. When we come together, I want to be thinking about, what other safety net we can provide for our community in the absence of a social safety net that's provided by our federal government. How can we be working together around mental health care and wraparound services for the individual artists, and allowing people to show up as their whole selves to the work, so that we support them as individuals and we also support the creating that they want to do, right? So I see a real future in this coalition building nonsense. So I think there's so many ways that we can be working together to streamline our own labor, but most importantly, the labor that our artists have to put forth in order to sustain themselves and resource themselves in their work.
Can I just add the labor that we need to sustain? Because I think, we've been talking around this, but artist service organizations are often straddle a funny place between like having a lot in common with our members or our constituencies, however we define those, and then having our own needs, all of which have been, almost thoroughly exhausted over the last 2 years. And so not only is the collaboration essential to how we distribute resources in a more equitable way to our communities, but it is also essential so that we can, sustain, stay resilient, and find new ways of thriving.
And I want to qualify that importantly, that the folks that run these grant making programs or are providing artist services or are providing professional development or are answering an artist's email seeking a resource are also arts workers whom we need to ensure are also having access to dignified wages as that work is happening. But if we're going to talk about collaboration, we can't do it without bringing back our friends in philanthropy into the conversation. So Anna, Michelle, Sarah, can you join us again? And I want to pose this question to all of us, right? What is our dream for the future regarding coalition-based funding, supporting artists, supporting institutions? If you had a blank check, what would you do? Randi, I see your eyes are glowing.
Yeah, a blank check is a very exciting question. I think I would lean into this safety net that we just talked about, and think about in our best and wildest dreams, what does an artist look like when they can show up wholly cared for to their work? So with a blank check, it would be a combination of pretty much what everybody talked about. It would be a guaranteed income for artists on an ongoing basis, and it would be mental health care at all times, and it's not an emergency. We need mental health care all the time. And it would be a living wage, and it would be support for our organizations with Gen Up money always. It would be Gen Up money always. And we would trust our artists to invest in themselves and in their work the way that we know they can. They are fully capable. We don't need to tell them how to take care of themselves. They know, they just need the resources, and they need easy access to those resources.
I'm a big yes, and I'll say, earlier I mentioned that we re-grant to small New York City theaters through funds provided by our colleagues at the Gilman Foundation. And one of the conversations that informed the creation of this fund was the need for multi-year general operating support for these smallest theaters. And so just to add that to what Randi is saying, right? That like, if we had a blank check, we would do everything that Randi was talking about, and it would be sustaining, it would be ongoing. And so we wouldn't have to work, and our constituents wouldn't have to work anemically because funding runs out or you have to roll off.
I'm sort of interested in the model where we could figure out the goals for a set period of time, say it's like a 10-year period or a 15-year period, and we could determine together that those were going to be our shared goals for that period of time. I'm thinking about Anna's great metaphor about the house. It can be very, very difficult, of course, moving down the road, thinking you're building a house and putting the wall in or putting the floor in, and then every 2 years having to reconstruct that wall or reconstruct that floor, because we all decide differently that what matters, right? Now, I will also, reference Alejandra's good point earlier about these things get made and then they don't get sustained. Well, you wouldn't necessarily have wanted to sustain the philanthropic thinking that was happening, say, in 1965 around arts funding, right? That when we were funding the opera and the ballet almost exclusively. So you do have to make a space in some way for new thinking to always be informing what we're doing. But if we could come to some sort of balance whereby there would be, a period of years where we agreed, and then we could keep going, and maybe at another point where we all agreed, reconsider. I think that would be a good use of a chunk of money.
Sarah, what have you heard from the group of artists that helped to develop these applications? What did they long for these programs to be? If they could have had their way, what would it have been like?
That's a great question, Alejandra. I think there was a big push, and an understandable push for artists to be paid the salary. So we are talking about a $65,000 a year salary plus benefits, to be paid that amount of funds just to do their work. So really, right, on their own to do their work, and to be trusted to do their work. And that was a big and extremely legitimate push, and a really honest discussion that happened among the artists. And simultaneous to that discussion was this idea of sort of this, also keeping that as sort of what folks wanted, but also really understanding that there was a broader ecosystem, an arts and cultural ecosystem, and communities that could also be impacted by their work. And so there was this sort of struggle between those two. But I think the idea of not just guaranteed income, which is of course helpful, but annual salaries for artists for their work.
Michelle, Anna, any things that emerge for you?
Well, when you posed that question a couple minutes ago, Alejandra, my first thought was it takes more than a blank check, to do all of this work that we're talking about. And, I think what's so amazing about the world in which we all work is that we can have these conversations, we can be creative, we can imagine, we can push, we can advocate, and we can have the opportunity to change our future in a way that maybe isn't as easy to do in other industries. I don't know, but I appreciate that about this and about this symposium. And I think that we're talking about some very specific changes, but we're also talking about very large changes in society. So where does our power start and end? It's blurry. But, going back to the topic of this morning, I think the power of coalitions and the power of us all knowing our part and our role. I think you talked about that earlier, Alejandra. If we know what our strongest place is in that coalition and we work together, we can, see some impactful change. And like Moira said, there has to be room for some movement because we don't know what's going to come around the corner, but we have to be able to maintain that strong base with the flexibility on top. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, but this is the framing that I'm doing as we continue to have this talk. And I hope we can keep coming together in this way to reassess and work together moving forward.
This is Michelle. For me, it's funny. I found this question very daunting. And I think it's because the real answer is, I don't know. I don't think that's ever been realized, and I don't think it's ever been considered. Like, what is this blank check? What does it look like for this sector? And what could we do to invest in this, truly invest in this sector and be artists? And so it's interesting, as a funder, there are so many parameters that you can fund within. It's set up so that you can only, focus on, you can only fund the performing arts, or you can only, a lot of funders are you can only fund the performing arts, or museums or visual arts. And so when you asked me, what does it look like? I'm not gonna lie, it took me out for a second, and I'm still trying to grapple with this question. I think for me personally, it's really doubling down on healthcare. As Randi said, safety nets. And even without this pandemic, I really, really do hope that, with this pandemic and understanding mental health is exacerbated, that funders really look at artists as whole beings, and that the health is not just physical, but it's also mental and emotional, and that artists can't do the work if they're not actually fully realized and fully understood. And so I'm going to leave with the healthcare piece. And it's not only mental health, but it's also aging artists as well. And so, yeah, I think for us, that's what the Illumination Fund will consistently be focused on.
There are just two things that came up in the chat, and we won't be able to get into all of the details of it, but I did want to name a couple of things that artists brought up in the chat in terms of, you apply to something and you don't get it, and you don't know what to do next. You don't know how to build the relationship or amend what you wrote so that you can get the kind of support that you're looking for. Or folks are seeking general operating support and then find that they have to itemize so stringently, even with general operating support. These questions emerge from some of the practices that we've seen historically in our sector. And I know that some things have changed while others have seemed to change, but actually are exactly the same. Any thoughts on what is something that you learned in this pandemic that you will not return to?
My immediate answer, Alejandra, and I'm channeling Karine. This is actually something we started a little while ago, but we are really doing everything we can to move away from written reports. And we, for a number of our funding programs, and this has increased during the pandemic, instead of written reports, we do like exit interviews with grantees. So it relieves a large work burden from them not to have to write a long thing. And it also helps build a relationship through a dialogue about, their experiences from the application through the reporting process, and of course talking about how the funds impacted their work, and what their continued challenges are, which not only again helps build a relationship but also informs us about other programs that we might want to create, change, enhance, etc.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, Risa, because we also have recently experimented with stopping a requirement for written reports, which was very small part of our process anyway. I think little things like that are important. They're big things too. And so the more we can refine our process based on, everything we've learned over the past 2 years, and we'll continue to learn through that dialogue with artists and applicants, I think is important. And, just being open to making a change. It's easier in some places than others, but I think that's maybe the bigger takeaway.
Sort of along those lines, I suppose. I'm sorry, Sarah, please.
No, go ahead, Moira.
Real quick, along those lines, we do a big audit of the application every year, and this year, and I'm sure ongoingly, I think it started last year, no budgets for at the application stage. We don't need to know a fiction. I mean, I'm not putting that on the artist. I'm just saying it's going to be a fiction because it's not there yet. We don't need to know that before we determine whether this artist aligns with the goals of the MAP Fund, and we can find that out later if and when they are we are able to support them. So it's sort of along the same lines as reporting.
That's a big one. Sarah?
I think we're not asking for reports, nor are we asking for budgets, which is great. But I think a lot of it is also just trust in the co-creation and planning. And most important, I think, pushing especially foundations and philanthropy to trust folks who they don't know. So bringing on folks who they've never met before and they don't know what they will say in a meeting, and bringing them into the process to hear their voices. I think that's really something that's been successful for us and really exciting.
To Sarah's point, this is Randi. Not shying away from conflict around the process, leaning into it. Our applications are always 10 minutes or less on the phone from the bathroom at your second job is the way that my dog right now is barking, sorry. So trust is a big one, and not something I'm really taking away from this moment is not believing that anyone has necessarily any more or less to say in the room about anything. We all nobody knew what to do. Let's be real. Nobody knew exactly what to do at the beginning of this process. We all have our ideas of how we show up in the world and how we serve each other. But the truth was the funders, the service organizations, and the artists We knew we needed to be resourced. We knew we needed to eat. We knew we needed to pay our bills. But that was about it. That's what we knew at the beginning of this. So being willing to show up fully as individuals, not shying away from conflict around that, not shying away from being wrong around that, and not being afraid to be right about certain things at certain times and wrong at other times. I mean, that wasn't a totally clear thought, but that's what I think I took away most from this period is, who knows, let's all try and see what happens. But let's, lean into that trying a little bit.
Any parting thoughts, Michelle? You don't have to if you don't have any. I wanted to give you a chance as we close out.
No, unfortunately for us, we do have to ask for budgets and reports, written reports and proposals. And we do understand that we don't want to be asking a lot from organizations, but this is information that we do need to make recommendations to the board. But for me, I hope that we can do another RFP, so more arts organizations can be funded through this process. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. You should have sessions that are starting right now on the other Zoom rooms. I'm going to pass it back to Shani. Thank you to our panelists for being with us. And here we are, supporting artists as necessary workers.
Let me just say thank you to each of our panelists for your transparency and also for being so generous with your time and expertise. It was really a beautiful way to begin our final day of the 2022 Dance NYC Symposium. To our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you were able to take away some useful ideas and considerations. We invite you to join us in the session follow-up chat in the community section to take a few questions and also wrap up the conversation. And I also would like to give a final thank you to our sponsors, and to Tammy Milkowitz from the Viscardi Center, and Jessica Ames and Pam Pritzker-Ridley from Sign Nexus for their invaluable support. So what's next? One, you can move your bodies in our daily dance break, which is facilitated and presented by Kumbe Center for African and Diaspora Dance. It starts right now. You can also continue to experience the symposium by visiting our sponsors in the exhibitor hall or creating virtual meetups at our community board. Another equally valid option is to take some time away from the screen and just rest. To explore more concepts within life cycles, livelihoods, and legacies, our 2022 symposium theme, we have 6 more daytime sessions coming up. 3 will be held at 12 p.m. and then 3 more at 2:30 p.m. In between those, at 1:30, you can take your lunch or head over to the exhibitor hall for the last virtual expo showcase of the symposium. Tonight's closing program will include remarks from Dance NYC, artistic offerings by the Clark Center and Hunter College Dance Department, and a keynote conversation entitled Building Community Around Dance for a Future Society. It will feature Adam Hafez, Chris Walker, Kamal Sinclair, and Christopher McDowell, and the panel will be moderated by the brilliant Onye Ozuzu. Have a really wonderful day, everyone. Cheers. Thank you for joining today's session. A special thanks to our funders, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Howard Gilman Foundation, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. A special thanks to our lead corporate sponsor, Con Edison, and our lead dance advocate, Jody Gottfried Arnold. Subsidies for the education and dance worker ticket tiers are made possible by the Arnold Foundation. A special thanks to our leader, host, and partner level sponsors, 92nd Street Y, Harkness Dance Center, Dance Education Library, Cataliotti Law, Full Out Creative, Gibney Dance Center, Kumbe Center for African and Diaspora Dance, the Actors Fund, Ballet Hispanico, Fit for Dance, Nai Ni Chin Dance Company, NDI Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, New York Live Arts, and Tom O'Connor Consulting Group. And last, but certainly not least, a special thanks to our Justice, Equity, and Inclusion partners, Art Beyond Sight, Art Space Sanctuary, Asian American Arts Alliance, Center for Traditional Music and Dance, the International Association of Blacks in Dance, Lotus Music and Dance, Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium, National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, New York Foundation for the Arts, and Women of Color in the Arts. Up next, at 12 o'clock, we begin our early afternoon sessions. At 1:30, you may take personal time, rest, and enjoy a nourishing meal. At 2:30, we begin our late afternoon sessions. And at 4:15, we gather in our daily debrief. At 6 o'clock, we gather for our final keynote presentation. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSimp, DanceNYC 2022, and DanceSimp 2022. On Instagram at dance.nyc, on Twitter at dance.nyc, and on Facebook at dance/NYC. Some features not to miss. Build your agenda of sessions. Connect with other attendees. Join community conversations. Visit the exhibitor hall. Don't forget to check out the 2022 Symposium digital program book. How are we doing? Did you like a session? Use the like feature on your favorite session. Got feedback for us? Take the post-event survey after March 19th and tell us how we did. Need help? Email us at customerservice@dance.nyc. A special thanks to our broadcast streaming partners at Full Out Creative. Thanks for joining. Keep in touch at dance.nyc.